I think one should also say something about their attitude towards science. That is, it seems to me this is one of the things that divides Marxism, or the various Marxisms, is their attitude towards science. And Western Marxism, as it's called, or neo-Marxism, as it's sometimes called, Hegelian Marxism, is notoriously hostile to science, where the other kind of Marxism, I'm not sure whether that's supposed to be called Soviet Marxism, Orthodox Marxism, Althusserian Marxism too, is, on the contrary, has a great stake in the notion of science. The problem is, the problem is a more general one. It's not only one of Marxism, it's common to all forms of historicism. In other words, if you say that ideas spring from and are conditioned by unique historical situations, conditions of possibility, you can't think a certain idea except when these preconditions are there, then science itself becomes historically determined. And you can't know scientific truth until these particular historical preconditions are obtained, and so on and so forth. Well, that point of view is little by little going to hollow out the very claim of science to being absolute, to being law, to being transhistorical, and so forth, and tends to undermine what we customarily think of as scientific. Now, I think it's very easy for humanists to make critiques of science, but I suspect that scientists would not see science in this way, and that many of these descriptions of science are not probably are inappropriate. And today there are more and more descriptions of science from the inside that make it clear that it's not a question of a system of absolute laws, absolute truth, and so on, and that there's a lot of there's an optical illusion at work here where humanists are thinking of the thought of the other. This is Lacan's critique of science, that normally science is the very picture that we have of science involves what he calls le sujet supposé savoir, the subject who knows, but that's another subject, that's somebody else. It's never us. So this illusion of the absolute binding truth of science is also a relationship to other people, in the sense that it projects this absolute other in whose mind all these laws have some kind of ultimate comprehensible existence, where we from the outside don't understand it very well, but yet we accord its right to absolute to an absolutely binding state because of our belief in the existence of this other, or this subject who's supposed to know. Now, I don't know how much of that is at work in the Frankfurt School, but it seems to me again that, for example, the more recent descriptions of science, I'm thinking of a book by Paul Feyerabend called Against Method, who says it's wrong to think even that there's one paradigm of science in any given period. There are lots of different paradigms. They're unrelated. Science is not continuous but discontinuous, and all these things are going on at once. There isn't any subject who totalizes all these things. So in that sense, the notion that we used to have of scientific truth or something, the positivist idea, is fallacious even from the point of view of scientific work and of the mental operations of the scientists. I think I just wanted to raise this because we didn't get to it yesterday. It seems to me important to show that we don't have to really adopt this complete rejection of science by the Frankfurt School, because ultimately that also is conditioned by their starting point. That is, if it's so that science is a will to power, domination of nature, and so on, then everything follows. And lots of interesting things, as we saw, do follow from that starting point. The trouble is that the starting point ends up also being a limit, and I think one of the things that it limits is science itself. Okay, I want to get into Lord Jim today as rapidly as we can. I'm going to use both sides of this, so I wanted to at least give you have we talked about Helmslaff? This is a formulation of the form-content distinction, which I think is more useful than the ordinary one, about which most people have learned that it's bad and you shouldn't talk that way and use those terms and so on. Helmslaff's linguistics sees the relationship of, this is a model of language. It's not a model of literary works, but I'm saying that we can adapt this to literary works in some interesting ways. Sees the relationship of form to what used to be called content in these terms. He calls it form and substance, or raw material. And he sees in each of these levels, that is, you can talk about language in terms of form, pure form, and you can talk about it in terms of the substance of language, the sounds and so forth, for example, or the semantic content. There are any number of ways of formulating this. And each of these levels is itself divided into something like a form-content opposition. So on the level of form, you can talk about its expression or its content. Form has itself a content, which I think is a very interesting idea for us. And when you're talking about substance, it also is divided into expression and content. Now, this would be the level, I think, on which you'd find the kind of analyses Lévi-Strauss does of the way primitive thought or modern thought sorts out the world in kind of typological systems. That is, the substance of our verbal acts or the myths or our thoughts and so on, is this sort of picture of the world as divided up into masses which are organized according to certain typological systems? Well, that would be the expression of substance, and that one could make a structural analysis of. And then there's the actual content of the substance, which in my reading would be related to historical preconditions. Of course, the expression of form are the kinds of things that a purely formalizing criticism has always dealt with. Now, I want to I point this out. I'm not going to work this out in detail for Lord Jim, but I think it's very suggestive, and it allows us to talk about several planes of the work, to separate them, and then to join them together again. The planes that I want to talk about, Lord Jim, in terms of are. But I'm going to turn it around then and use this Clay Mouse thing again. Are, on the one hand, that of Impressionism, the kind of primacy of the category of the impression, the vision, the pure sensation. And that is taking place, it seems to me, on the level of form. And one could talk about that all by itself, and we will have to talk about it separately from the rest. But then something else is going on in the work, too. And I should warn you then that the principal way that I read this work, or the grid through which I read it, is Sartrean existentialism, because I think there's a great deal already of existentialism in this work, and I find it impossible not to read it in those terms. I don't know, that may be a personal deformation, but that gives us a whole other level of this work to deal with, which must be related to the other, but it isn't related directly. So I want to talk about it on the level of writing, pure impressionism, but then I want to be able to talk about it also in terms of a kind of existentialist interrogation of what an act is, what an event is, what a choice is, and so forth, because those are Conrad's terms. I mean, whatever variation in terminology we want to use. And then we want to see how you can have these two levels going at once, what their relationship is, and one also wants to respect the discontinuity of those things, because they happen at different levels. That is, we're reading along on the level of the individual sentence, or at the rate of speed of the individual sentence, we get impressions. At the rate of speed of the anecdote and of the larger kind of narrative, that's not at all what we focus on. We're focusing on then the nature of action and so on and so forth. And we have to somehow do justice to both these things and at the same time do justice to their manifest discontinuity. And I should say that's another way of connecting back up to the Frankfurt School yesterday. One of the great things that I think Adorno was able to do and to show in his artistic criticism, most of it is musical criticism rather than literary or painting or anything, is that the work of art is a discontinuity, is a set of discontinuities. And it seems to me this is, if there's a postmodernist criticism as opposed to a modernist criticism, it seems to me that's one of the places where that happens. The new critics wanted to devise models of the organic unity of the work and so on. Not all of them, but I mean that's really the dominant. We were taught to read novels to try to show the profound unity of a work and how everything fit in together and so on. Seems to me the modern criticism, as said, is the most dramatic kind of example of that, wants to pulverize a work, show that it's really just a collection of broken pieces, or it's a set of discontinuous models all at work at once. And we find that, as I say, in Assed, you find it in Demands and Derrida's kind of criticism of all these different models that are at work. You find it in Adorno, and so on and so forth. And next term, we'll come back to that when we look at prisms and when we also look at the Telquel group and Maschre and see some of the ways that's been worked out. But I think we must already begin to do that in Lord Jim. And the point is that the work is itself, this is not our method that we come along and impose, but the work is itself discontinuous. And I think it's much more interesting to say, here we have an already fragmented set of materials on all these levels. And what Conrad is trying to do, and what the work is trying to do, is to reunify those. But we can't even respect the power of this gesture of reunification unless we first start with all the fragments. Because unless we start with the fragments, we're not aware of the immense kind of productive effort that there was to try to pull all those back together again and to hold them together in the unity of a single voice or a single language or a single book, because ultimately that's the only unity that there is here. Okay, now let's see, I want to, let me just see what order I want to deal with these things in. Well, let me start this way. It seems to me, and I guess this is commonly agreed, that the first 150 pages of this are one of the most incredibly sustained efforts in all of the history of modern or modernist writing. That is, that there's something about the way this thing moves and about the kind of complete randomness of everything, but a randomness which is sort of moved along by almost a single thread, which is very remarkable and almost a sheer natural formation of some kind. Now, we want to try to do justice to that. On the other hand, to say that is also to raise a problem, because then we have to ask what happens to the rest of it. And clearly the rest of it is not on the same level. And if we have a theory of this work, it ought to be a theory of how the second half is not as good as the first, or why it's qualitatively different, why this book breaks down, and so forth. So we'll try to do that. I hope that in trying to do that also, that's the other thing I want to say about existentialism, that even though I'm using that whole systematic set of terms and problems, that whole problematic as a way of reading this, I'd like also, since that can no longer really be our terms anymore, I'd like also to, if possible, to use this reading as a way of saying something historical about existentialism too, or somehow putting a certain distance between us and that grid that we're obliged to use by the nature of the text. That would hold then for the first part of the book, and something similar would have to be done for the second part. I think we can say already what happens to it. It flattens out into an adventure novel. That is to say, it flattens out into something which is essentially popular literature, the bestseller, which is a genre of the nascent culture industry then. And why that should be the case, I think, is very interesting. And so Conrad, the very discontinuities in this book, and now I've talked about three of them. One is a level of stylistic production. One is a level of kind of proto-existential plot. And finally, there's this production of the adventure tale, which is yet another thing. Seems to me that in this discontinuity, we're at a very basic kind of parting of the ways for literature itself. And we're at the very moment when, all of a sudden, what used to be literature, Balzac there wasn't any high literature in the time of Balzac. He was both a poet, but also a writer of bestsellers, and there wasn't any real distinction in that period. At this point, these things are separating. And after this, and I'm using this as a kind of historical fable, but after this point, this is 1900, after this point, it will not be possible to do all these things at once. Either you write high literature or you write bestsellers. But these can no longer be combined, and maybe the naturalists and Zola were the last people who could do that. So the book then should be very interesting as an object of analysis from that point of view too. That is, it should have a secret for us about what happened to text, to literature, to narrative in modern times or in recent times. The other thing I think one wants to observe, and I just pointed out, I don't know, I have the means to follow it up, but it is interesting that this started as a short story. You can imagine what kind of a short story it would have been. That is, here is a curious encounter. You see this young man there who looks like a perfectly ordinary water clerk. Well, every time a job gets going, suddenly he drops it and goes somewhere else. So that would have essentially been this little tale, and the secret would have been that years ago he jumped off a boat, and thus he's trying to hide. He thinks nobody knows who he is, and so on. Everybody knows, but when he finds out, he leaves and he goes and he sort of pursues his itinerary all over Southeast Asia. Well, that would have been essentially that's the story that Conrad set out to write. Then this thing took over. I think it's very important to see Ulysses also started as a short story. It was to be something of the length of the early Dubliners, not even of the Dead. I think there's some other examples, can't remember offhand. I think it's important to take into consideration the possibility that what we think of as the modern novel is not descended from the novel at all, but from something else, and is an expansion of something of a very different kind than were the older kinds of so-called realistic novels. And I think if we thought about these two things in those terms, we might, some of the false problems of a modernism, realism, antagonism might be solved too, and we would have a very different notion of how the seeds of this turn into a text rather than a narrative, because that's really how one would characterize, I think, a modernist work. And that's what's so extraordinary about this whole first 150 pages. It's a text. And we would maybe understand a little better why we feel the kind of odd distance we do from so-called 19th century novels, if that's a real concept in its own right. One final thing, I guess some of this will come up a little bit later, but I wanted to say something about how the relationship of this to the period. Since I've talked about it in terms of a text, we might just for a moment think of how that works. That is, what's extraordinary is that that all of this is turned back into, from a narrative, it becomes a series of stories, a series of individual narratives. And at every point, it's very extraordinary. As you read this first thing, there's a sort of relay of narrative centers where somebody tells a story, then that comes to an end, then you move along, and the minute Conrad or Marlowe or whoever reaches another character, that character is felt to be a potential story, and suddenly the text stops and it begins to circle around that character. You get a development, you get a kind of proto-story. If it fits, it goes on. If it doesn't, it stops, and then we move along to another one. And the whole thing is a relay of these, well, we can't call them points of view anymore, but I think the word is useful because the word allows us to compare this to period writing, which is in some ways very similar, in some ways very different. These texts now, I think you could effectively, profitably juxtapose those with Todorow's idea. I don't know if I've talked about that before. And the very best things I think that Todorov did when he was still a literary critic in Poetics of Prose are his essays on the Odyssey and on the 1001 Nights, in which he points out I don't know, have I said this before? I don't know. Where he says these characters are only in appearance characters. They're really walking tales. And what they do, if they have no story to tell, they don't exist. And in fact, in the whole economy of the 1001 Nights, when a character is brought before the Sultan or something, he says, not who are you, what's your name, but what is your story? And if they don't have a story, that's the end of them. I mean, so so the whole thing, and also in the Odyssey, I think Todorov is able in a very striking way to show that everything in the Odyssey is narrated, that the whole thing is about storytelling and the interference of stories and so on. I think it's clear that something like that's happening in Conrad. Now, if you think of it in terms of point of view, however, and if you've read any of Conrad's, how can I put it, secular writing, so to speak, that is his civilian writing or his onshore writing, if you've read a book like Chance, which has to be one of the most awful books. I think Levis, I understand Levis has just decided that it's one of his great works again, so that maybe you have to look at it again. But if you read something like that, or if you pay attention to Conrad's treatment of women, of which I think the kind of emblematic, the figure at the end of Heart of Darkness is emblematic. This is not true of Nostromo, where something else is going on. But if you look at that, you suddenly, there's a very odd kind of shift of optical, shift in perception, kind of gestalt shift, and it becomes clear just how very closely related this is to the kind of thing that James was writing. And how much this can very easily fold back into that kind of introspection, into that kind of fussiness and so forth. One can say that now. I guess it's becoming clear that Henry James was the greatest American novelist of the 1950s, but now we have a certain distance from that and can look at it with maybe more dispassion than one used to. And I think it's very interesting then how what in James remains psychological is organized in terms of psychology and the point of view of the mind thinking about things. This same kind of, and in James, as in many of the other people of this period, there becomes, the whole center of the narrative then is taken up by psychological relativism, the relativism points of view. If you begin with the idea of the monad, that there is a point of view, then what becomes interesting is how something looks different from another one and from another one, and so you get things like within the Good Soldier, and you get Pirandello's plays, and you get a whole series of quite different artifacts which are organized around this same principle of the multiplicity of worlds, the multiplicity of monads, points of view, and so on. Now, I think James has to be given credit for having formalized the notion of point of view and having really worked it out in its fullest way, and in many ways having dramatized all this more powerfully or explored it more deeply than other people. And Conrad, from that point of view, and at that moment, must have looked very regressive, because instead of having this kind of frontline or cutting edge exploration of what language could translate of mental events, and the way in which the very matrix of the work could do justice to this whole question of points of view, which makes up the phenomenology of intersubjectivity, which the philosophers have then talked about in terms of intersubjectivity, of the phenomenology of worldness, and so on and so forth. What in James looked more advanced than this, I think now tends to look the other way around, because James ultimately poses all these things not in terms of writing, but in terms of thinking. Not in linguistic terms, but in terms of consciousness and psychology. And so now, in a kind of odd, one of these interesting historical reversals, it's Conrad who looks more modern, because it's clear that what Conrad is doing is only in appearance reverting to older storytelling, to tale telling and so on, and taking up this persona of the teller of tales and this kind of archaic thing, which if you read, you must read, if you haven't, Walter Benjamin's marvelous essay called The Storyteller on Lescoff in Illuminations, where he talks about how there are certain types of activities that are quintessentially associated with the telling of tales. One is the merchant or the sailor, who goes to very different places, brings back these yarns from elsewhere about fabulous things, the Odyssey. Well, that clearly that substance allowed Conrad to adopt the mask of this particular form, which is an archaic form in this period. But now, as we look at it, it becomes clear that this now allows something to be written which is today called text. That is, it's something which has a very different structure from either Jamesian narrative or the old-fashioned storytelling too. And it's a kind of perpetual producing of language, which is very, very special, and which has of which then this becomes a kind of foreshadowing and an innovation. Okay, now let me get back then to the. Let me say another word or two about, because I'm going to spend less time on that, I think, about the whole matter of Impressionism. You all know or know of Conrad's famous Ars Poetica, which is the introduction to the Nigger of the Narcissus. It has this passage that's since become famous. Let's see, talk about the creative task, the only valid justification for the worker in prose. And if his conscience is clear, his answer to those who, in the fullness of a wisdom which looks for immediate profit, demand specifically to be edified, consoled, amused, who demand to be promptly improved or encouraged or frightened or shocked or charmed, his answer, that of the worker in prose, must run thus. My task, which I'm trying to achieve, is by the power of the written word to make you hear, to make you feel. It is before all to make you see that and no more. And it's everything. Now this whole, Conrad's aesthetic, in this sense, is locked into an aesthetic of Impressionism, of the image, and of the, and this book is just riddled with the following turn of phrase, which it would be tedious to dig out. Imagine this tableau. I can see this picture again now. It's all organized, but not any longer dramatic tableaus. In James, the organization of things was dominated by an ideal of the theater, which is then reinvented to impose unities and so on. Here, it's an ideal which is very much that of, it could be either Impressionist painting, certainly it's an Impressionist aesthetic, or it could be the kind of stuff of the late 90s, the kind of historical pictures of the late 19th century. I'm thinking of, this kind of thing on the cover. This is a little later, I think, but what do we have here? That's not of any great distinction, but there's a lot of late 19th century representational painting which tries to do something like this, and I think this, I think especially of Russian painting, because aren't there Repin and all of the famous, these things range either from historical scenes, Ivan the Terrible killing his son, to genre scenes and so on. But it's very characteristic of that moment when artists had almost a ready-made technique of representation, the moment when photography is just about to sweep all that away. And I think it's interesting, too, in this sense that stuff in painting is very decidedly second-rate. I don't mean the Impressionists, but I mean these kinds of things. But in words, in the prose that results from the worker in prose, which is Conrad's task, suddenly the value of the aesthetic value is very different and qualitatively very different. And I think that's an instructive lesson as to the ways in which the media themselves shift position in any given period. So that at a certain moment, one medium will be a privileged expression for the development of something, which, when it's reflected in the other media, turns out to be of no great historical or aesthetic consequence, and that can shift around. That is, it's obviously not always, not even very often, language, which is the primary medium, but it can be something else. So I'm not going to talk a great deal about this level, the level of form here, although let me read you the equivalent in Lord Jim. This is page 111 of this Ars Poetica here. It's a moment when Marlowe. I'm about to talk about a character who's French, and that's the contamination. Is reflecting about something that this French captain has said. Nothing could have been more commonplace than this remark, but its utterance coincided for me with a moment of vision, always in terms of eyesight. It's extraordinary how we go through life with eyes half shut, with dull ears, with dormant thoughts. Perhaps it's just as well, and it may be that it is this very dullness that makes life to the incalculable majority so supportable and so welcome. Nevertheless, there can be but few of us who had never known one of these rare moments of awakening when we see, hear, understand ever so much, everything in a flash, before we fall back again into our agreeable somnolence. Here is the whole aesthetics of make it new, of the Russian formalists, the destruction of habituation, the reinvention of perception, and so on. Now, there are other ways of saying this, of course. You have the moment in which Jim is the producer of text or the narrator, and that's a very limited part of this book, you understand. But after page 29. Let's see. Well, the essentials here. Yeah. After his first feeling of revolt, he'd come around to the view that only a meticulous precision of statement would bring out the true horror behind the appalling face of things. The facts those men, the court, were so eager to know had been visible, tangible, open to the senses, occupying their place in space and time, requiring for their existence a 1,400-ton steamer and 27 minutes by the watch. They made a whole that had features, shades of expression, a complicated aspect that could be remembered by the eye, and something beside, something invisible, a directing spirit of perdition that dwelt within like a malevolent soul in a detestable body. Well, that's, I think, one would be tempted at once to make some kind of Derridian analysis of this notion that that the outside can reflect the inside as a body reflects a soul. That all of this inner thing that Jim is trying to express, and generally in Conrad, when you touch the point when that's evoked, it becomes an abstraction with a capital letter, like the unbearable, or the ideal, or the unrealizable, or something like that. And it's clear that that's a very curious way of thinking about it. That's a very great leap to believe that those feelings, or whatever they are, that intangible thing, that intangible abstraction, can really be rendered by a visual impression, because that's essentially what Conrad is telling us. He's telling us that there exists for all of those things a visual impression. And of course, if there doesn't, the whole thing falls to pieces. That is, his aesthetic falls to pieces. It can't work. Now, I think then this causes us, and this has to do then with space and time too. I was looking for another little passage where he says, this all happened at once, but I have to tell it in time, and so on. That's a more banal part of this problem. But I think the essential is this belief that these things correspond, or put it in more modern terms too, that there is that something does correspond to this set of signifiers, which are the visual impressions, the words, the key words, the various broken pieces which make up an impression, and that after you put it together can be said to correspond to some signified behind it, or referent, or whatever. There's a notion here of a kind of imminence, of a possible imminence of meaning to expression, which, it's true, is being questioned in the sense that it's a very rare kind of event. It has to be a single moment, and it doesn't happen all the time. Not everything falls into a tableau. Not everything is an impression like this. Not everything has an idea behind it. But still, at these fleeting sort of fragmentary moments, even though time is broken down into those dreary parts that have no impressions or meaning, and these instants or tableaus or visions, nonetheless, when it comes, you can somehow seize it, and that's something that I think will be in some ways brought into question again by in later literature. That is the very possibility of this, and other things come into being. That is, one can then imagine, almost a Frankfurt School kind of aesthetic in which what you began to show was not the perception or the impression, but the fact that you couldn't have any, and that you invented the very idea of perceiving, and by showing that it was impossible or something. And I think we'll see this happening in Lewis, for example. Lewis's style is governed by the very deep feeling that you really can't convey anything in words. And at that point, and this is a painter, at that point something quite different happens to style. You have a passage from this Impressionism, belief in in the power to convey these things to something which is cubist or futurist or something like that. I wanted to read you then finally an impression, just to give you an idea of how this works, if I can find it. Yeah, this is going to the final session of the court in the judgment, page 122. There was, as I walked along, the clear sunshine, a brilliance too passionate to be consoling, the streets full of jumbled bits of color, like a damaged kaleidoscope, and that's almost a figure for this whole process. Yellow, green, blue, dazzling white, the brown nudity of an undraped shoulder, a bullock cart with a red canopy, a company of native infantry in a drab body with dark heads marching in dusty laced boots, a native policeman in a somber uniform of scanty cut and belted in patent leather, who looked up at me with orientally pitiful eyes as though his migrating spirit were suffering exceedingly from that unforeseen, what do you call them, avatar incarnation. And then we go on, the villagers connected with the assault case sat in a picturesque group that's under a tree, looking like a chromolithograph of a camp in a book of Eastern travel. So this is now there's a movement of recontainment. You have this breaking of the world into a jumble. There's a sort of moment when the raw material of the world is centrifugal. It breaks out in all directions. You don't know how to hold it back. And then the next sentence will try to sweep all that back into the unity of representation. That is, the chromolithograph assures you that this is all reunified and that this is a unity of perception. Indeed, that's sort of the dialectic of Conrad's perceptions here, that their logic is absolute fragmentation. But of course, perceptions want to have a kind of coherence, and so there's a constant sort of tension between this tendency for everything to break down. And if that went far enough, and we see that on the level of storytelling, this is happening with events, right? That is, what on the level of perception becomes impressions. The fact that you take, we talked about this last time, and I don't want to go into it in more detail today, but you take a coherent event. I walked from my hotel to the court, and then that coherent event begins to break into pieces, and instead you begin to live little stretches of it, one block, and suddenly that stretch of block breaks into various pictures, and your thoughts, and then yourself, you see, the self which is the continuity from the hotel to the court and from yesterday to today and so on, begins to break up, and we have something approaching the schizophrenic text. Well, that's taking place then on the level of the substance also. That is, this is happening to events and to acts. And now a kind of analytic interrogation of acts is taking place, where we ask ourselves, well, what's it if you sign up on a boat and you go out, or you undertake a profession? That's an act and a choice, kind of global choice. Can that be broken down? Well, yes, you have the exercise of the profession. Well, then you have almost a year by year and then a month by month breakdown. And then suddenly it begins to resolve itself even. You begin to live little stretches of it, one block, and suddenly that stretch of block breaks into various pictures, and your thoughts, and then yourself, you see, the self which is the continuity from the hotel to the court and from yesterday to today and so on, begins to break up, and we have something approaching the schizophrenic text. Well, that's taking place then on the level of the substance also. That is, this is happening to events and to acts. And now a kind of analytic interrogation of acts is taking place, where we ask ourselves, well, what's it if you sign up on a boat and you go out, or you undertake a profession? That's an act and a choice, kind of global choice. Can that be broken down? Well, yes, you have the exercise of the profession. Well, then you have almost a year by year and then a month by month breakdown. And then suddenly it begins to resolve itself even further into its smallest parts. And when we get to the end of it, we don't know what the smallest part is. It's something like, and this would be the existential level of this, it's something like a choice or an act or what Sartre calls freedom. That is, this moment when suddenly Time is reduced to its smallest instant, and there's nothing that makes the continuity from one instant to the next. You have to decide. It only rests on you and on nothing else, and so there's a kind of void, there's a kind of leap. And that proves to be this sort of empty center of what looked like unified acts, unified thoughts, values, and all those things. The great representation is, of course, the moment in which Jim leaps into the dinghy, but you note that we never see that moment. What is told us, and this would be what like a future anterior or something. What is told us is simply, I had jumped. I had jumped. It already takes place. We don't see events, acts, choices in the moment of emergence because somehow that's so microscopic that it's invisible. The other place that's very nice in which Conrad shows this is later on in the adventure section. Let me see if I can find this. When Jim flees he's arrived in the Raja's camp and is being held there. Was not clear. Nobody really knows. The Raja isn't sure whether he's imprisoning him, and Jim isn't sure whether he's a prisoner or what he's doing there. But all of a sudden, Jim decides to run away. If I can locate that, or if anyone has it here. I'm just trying to find my own, understand what I called this when I wrote it down. And at any rate, the process is it's early in this section. It's a very striking way of writing out something which, later on in Sartrean existentialism, becomes a kind of almost a commonplace of the way what one does to narrative temporality. And let's see. I can find this. Yes, okay. This is, yeah. He's jumping over the fence. The high, page 193. The higher firm ground was about 6 feet in front of him. I reached and grabbed desperately. I thought I would have to die there all the same, he said. He reached and grabbed desperately with his hands, and only succeeded in gathering a horrible, cold, shiny heap of slime against his breast up to his very chin. It seemed to him he was burying himself alive, and then he struck out madly, scattering the mud with his fists. It fell on his head, his face, over his eyes, into his mouth. He told me that he remembered suddenly the courtyard. That's where he's come from. He's racing. This is an instant where he's jumping out. He's afraid of being shot by the people in the courtyard. He's trying to get across and get into the village where he'll be safe. So he was only in the courtyard a minute earlier. He told me that he remembered suddenly the courtyard, as you remember a place you'd been very happy years ago. He longed, so he said, to be back there again, mending the clock. That's what he was passing his time doing. Mending the clock, that was the idea. He made efforts, tremendous, sobbing, gasping efforts that seemed to burst his eyeballs in their sockets and make him blind, and culminating in one mighty supreme effort in the darkness to crack the earth asunder, to throw it off his limbs, and he felt himself creeping feebly up the bank, and so on and so on. He will have it that he did actually go to sleep, that he slept, perhaps for a minute, perhaps for 20 seconds, or only for 1 second, but he recollects distinctly the violent convulsive start of awakening. He remained lying still for a while, then he rose muddy from head to foot and stood there, and finally he gets behind the houses. But all this has taken place in a space of time which is almost infinitesimal. So what's happened is that when you begin to fragment time and interrogate time in this sense, it also proves not to have any basis. It also opens up, and there isn't anything there. So this is what I want to suggest in passing from the level of form, the way in which reification operates on. This is both of these things, both of these forms of fragmentation, and the type of aesthetic language or aesthetic discourse that results, or artistic discourse that results from them. Both are, it seems to me, to be reconnected to the very notion of reification itself. As what is destroying the organic unity of acts and events, and also of the names that we used to give those events. So what happens on the level of perception is that this absolute fragmentation, and one can talk about it in social terms, that is, it's a, if you want to, people used to talk about this in terms of the confusion of the big city, the way that modern industrial life is a kind of, and Benjamin still talks about it in this way too, the way it's a kind of constant assault on the senses. The human sense organs aren't made to support this kind of battery of sensations of all kinds, and from modern life. What happens then is that the old recognizable objects, the old unities of action, the old unities of events break up, are now rationally reorganized in the Taylorizing sense of being put back together in instrumental fashion, in Adorno's sense, and also in the sense of Weber's rationalization. And so when that happens, something meaningful is taken apart and put back together in such a way that it is no longer meaningful in an immediate way. It's only instrumentally meaningful. That is, it's only meaningful in terms of profit, of rationalized organization. So what you have is a kind of meaningless surface. That is, it's meaningful behind the surface in terms of the new rational organization of the world, but it's not meaningful for the individual senses anymore. So there comes into being a compensation for that. And I would suggest, and I guess I did suggest last time, I remember that much of the charge and the quotient of perception and perceptual expression in modern literature is to be understood as the compensation for this breakdown of objects. It's like, or if you like, it's a kind of chemical byproduct. You know, you break a substance down into things that you can sell, and then there's some useful or less useful byproducts that come of that, and you figure out how you use those. Well, this perception itself, the physiological in modern literature, is, it seems to me, a part of this breakdown process. And it isn't present in older literature. It seems to me it's very wrong to think, if you look at Balzac carefully, you see that there's almost no real physiological, perceptual content at all. So that's a new thing, and we have to think about it. One has to invent a way of thinking about it, which I think, in which little by little we accustom ourselves to understanding that the senses themselves are historical. I would quote Marx's famous remarks in the early manuscripts about how the senses themselves have a history that one can write, and this is part of that history. The emergence of the modern senses, and then of the things we try to do to the modern senses, and I think all of the whole perceptual revolution then, and the counterculture, and that whole kind of left utopianism that begins in Fourier and ends up in Marcuse and the New Left, and also its more secular or more less revolutionary forms of libidinal transformation and drugs and so on, is ultimately part of this process of fragmentation, in which now the body, as a separate thing from all the rest, comes to have a sort of semi-autonomy, and then that becomes an area in which a revolution of its own type and according to its own physiological logic can take place. Maybe it's connected to the other revolutions, maybe not, but that's now a separate area of, we can't call it experience anymore because that would reassume a whole. So I think on that level, but the other point I want to make, and when we come to talk about ideological analysis, I think this will also have some more meaning, but I want to say that when one reads something like this in that way, it's important to realize that it's a double phenomenon. That is that, and this is where I think that we can both use later Lukács, but also have a certain distance from those formulations. That is, I think what I've been saying is very consistent with Lukács's idea that modernism is a result of, well, he has words that we don't use anymore for decadence and so on and so on. That modernism is an expression of the breakdown of modern life, of the breakdown of modern middle-class life, of the action on modern middle-class life of rationalization and so on, and the very breakdown and reification of middle-class consciousness and so forth. It's an expression of that. That's all Lukács says in those texts, the most notable or most accessible being Meaning of Contemporary Realism, that has several titles, that little pamphlet, but you can find it throughout. And the essay of his that I like the best in that connection is In Writer and Critic, the one on narrate or describe, because that's the point being made. Narration still governs a world of organic meanings and events. Description corresponds now to a world of broken pieces, and all you can do, nothing is whole anymore. All you can do is just sort of enumerate them. Well, catalogs are another place where one finds an interesting symptom of this whole breakup and fragmentation of the world. Where I would what I would add to Lukács is that while it seems to me absolutely the case that this kind of perceptual modernism, in Conrad's sense, this what I'm calling his Impressionism, is a reflection of the breakdown of modern life, and therefore is of a piece with it, and if you like, even reinforces it. And thus is part of a negative ideological judgment, I guess. It seems to me that you're not giving a complete picture unless you understand that it's also a compensation for it, and that it has something which is, besides being ideological, which is utopian. And that this intensity of perception is also a way of trying to restore or reinvent some newer meaning to that rubble of broken pieces that has no meaning anymore. So I think if one is doing this kind of, if one is making this kind of systematic connection between the emergence of a new aesthetic phenomenon and something that's happening on the level of substance in the historical world, something that's progressively happening to society, to the raw materials of art, I think if one makes this connection between a text and its subtext, if you like, or aesthetic phenomenon and its context, it has to always be double. It has to always be dual. And it has to show how this way in which the artistic language reflects historical reality is always both ideological in that it becomes a kind of mere expression of it and reinforcement of it, and utopian in that it has to, in its very nature of art, somehow compensate for it and restore everything that's missing in it. And unless one sees it in these two ways, it seems to me one has a very poor and impoverished notion of how art functions, because each one gives us, I think, a partial or a merely ideological view of art. Lukács's view of modernism shows these things as mere products of a kind of bourgeois ideologues who are cranking out mere symptoms. On the other hand, if you insist only on the utopian side of this, if you forget about the way in which this is profoundly linked to fragmentation and rationalization in its very bones, and if you only insist on the function of art to compensate, to restore in a utopian fashion, then you're in the other ideology. Then you're in the ideology of modernism and the whole party line of modernism that's gone on from the classical period all the way to Christophe Telquel, the idea that it's enough to write the new artistic text which subverts reality and calls reality into question. And that is a revolutionary act in itself. And little by little, if that's the case, you don't need any others. And so, or Adorno's whole view of art, as it's expressed in his final period, it seems to me that also, if that view of art as only utopian, also is less interesting because it doesn't allow us to do justice to this tension, and that's the most, I think, that's only through being aware of that tension between the ideological and the utopian does the work have a real kind of concrete function for us and in social history. Okay, so we're now, I think, kind of moving from this level of form to the level of substance, and from the notion of the way in which perceptual fragmentation, its relationship to history, and the way in which this new invention of a new style corresponds to a new historical moment and reflects it, but also compensates it, to the other level of the narrative, what I've called the existential level. There, I think we may want to go back to my other, Jamesian. Can people see it up here? Is there any advantage to its being down lower? Maybe you can see it better. Can people see it? Not at all. In any case, yes, no, maybe. Well, this is just this famous thing, you know, that I've put up before, which has the two terms, S and its opposite, and then they're negatives, not S, not anti-S. And this is theoretically each of these then has combinations possible, sort of syntheses. The syntheses of the two top terms is called the complex term. That would be a kind of ultimate overcoming of this basic contradiction. The synthesis of the two bottom terms is called the neutral term. It's the canceling out. The person who's done the most work on that is Louis Marin in his book on utopias, because his interpretation of this, and I think it's very striking and interesting, is that is the place of utopia. He's interested in utopian narratives as such, Thomas More and so on, not in the Frankfurt School sense, but in the generic sense, that utopias are not a place of plenitude, of the overcoming of contradictions in which everything is present, but they're rather the place of the neutral, the place of the canceling out of everything, of the place where you don't have any contradictions because everything has been removed and not because it's all been put together. So his book Utopique is very important. I have a long review article of this in Diacritics. It's the spring issue, I think, or the summer issue of this year, in which I sort of try to develop that a little further, and that might be of some interest. In terms of Conrad, though, what we can say is this, that we have a character system at work here. It becomes clear when we look at the account of the Europeans and the others on page 16 and 17. Is this right? Wait a minute. I've had to transcribe these things from one edition to another, and I keep changing place numbers. I don't think that's right. It's page 16. Jim is just recovering from this accident to his leg. Directly he could walk without a stick, he descended into the town to look for some opportunity to get home. Nothing offered just then, and while waiting, he associated naturally with the men of his calling in the port. Okay, now typology. These were of two kinds. Some, very few, and seen there but seldom, led mysterious lives, had preserved an undefaced energy with the temper of buccaneers in the eyes of dreamers. They appeared to live in a crazy maze of plans, hopes, dangers, enterprises, ahead of civilization in the dark places of the sea, and their death was the only event of their fantastic existence that seemed to have a reasonable certitude of achievement. We'll see the later embodiment of these characters is, of course, Gentleman Brown in the final part of the book. And, of course, then their artistic discourse becomes the tale, because these are people to whom adventures really happen, or at least we're given to understand that. The majority were men who, like himself, and this like himself, he was one of us, and so on, is always a very ambiguous thing. But at any rate, a majority were men who, like himself, thrown there by some accident, had remained as officers of country ships. They had now a horror of the home service and its harder conditions, severe view of duty, and the hazard of stormy seas. They were attuned to the eternal peace of eastern sky and sea. They loved short passages, good deck chairs, large native crews, and the distinction of being white. They shuddered at the thought of hard work and led precariously easy lives, always on the verge of dismissal, always on the verge of engagement, serving Chinamen, Arabs, half-castes, would have served the devil himself had he made it easy enough. They talked everlastingly of turns of luck, how so-and-so got charge of a boat on the coast of China, a soft thing, how this one had an easy billet in Japan somewhere, and that one was doing well in the Siamese Navy. And in all they said, in their actions and their looks and their persons, could be detected the soft spot, the place of decay, the determination to lounge safely through existence. So we have an opposition which is one between adventure and routine. Of the first people you can tell stories, they are the Am Récit of Todorov. If you ever knew what their destinies are, but part of the fact that you can tell stories about them is that you don't know them, so it's sort of an illusion of adventure. The other ones are the people about whom there's nothing whatsoever to tell because they represent nothing but routine and so forth. Jim is clearly not really in either of these camps. So there's another term is to be located. And then as you go along, and right on the next page we have something very different. One wonders whether there aren't a few more slots in this character system. Two or three paragraphs later, the Patna, after she'd been painted outside and whitewashed inside, 800 pilgrims were driven on board of her as she lay with steam up alongside a wooden jetty. They streamed aboard over 3 gangways. They streamed in, urged by faith and the hope of paradise. They streamed in with a continuous tramp and shuffle of bare feet, without a word, a murmur, or a look back. And when clear of confining rails spread on all sides on the deck, flowed forward and aft, overflowed down the yawning hatchways, and so on, like water filling a cistern. 800 men and women with faith and hopes, with affections and memories. They had collected there, coming from north and south and from the outskirts of the east after treading the jungle paths, descending the rivers, coasting in prows along the shallows, crossing in small canoes from island to island, passing through suffering, meeting strange sights, beset by strange fears, upheld by one desire. These are the pilgrims. Now, this is clearly, here is something which is not the same as the adventure of the European buccaneers. But yet, it's not clearly a negative term either, like these captains who were just looking for a safe billet. It's a different term which has no equivalent in this European typology. So little by little, and I think now that we've read Flaubert, and I think I said something about the role of religion in the 19th century as being the optical illusion, the illusion now, and of the interest in religion by those who can no longer be religious. I think I quoted Weber's remark about his being religiously unmusical, and yet Weber is the great sociologist of religion, and immense parts of his work are this fascination for the study of something he can't understand or he's not in a position to feel from the inside. So little by little, religion becomes not really a philosophical matter. What's called belief is not a matter of thinking or something like that. It becomes the last trace of a different social formation. A social formation which is not Gesellschaft but Gemeinschaft, in which everybody is united by some, and the only word Conrad can find for it is idea, one idea. I mean, that's late 19th century jargon for this odd thing which belief and religion would be, which organic life would be. Different from animal life. These people are not, they're not in bad immediacy in Hegelian terms. This is a form of human and social existence, but it's one which entertains a different relationship to abstraction, idea, and value. That will be one of the other key late 19th century words. When Nietzsche talks about the transvaluation of all values, he's talking about a mode of study. He's saying, in order to see value as a thing that you can study in itself, you have to be beyond values. Otherwise, you're still in them and you're dominated by your own value and so on. And this, Weber inherits this from Nietzsche, and it really dominates the whole study of religion and of other values in the late 19th century. Well, here, for the secular world, for Europe, for capitalism, for human life in those conditions, value is no longer natural, no longer organic, and we always entertain problematical relationships to our choice of value, and everybody else has a different value, and the world is broken up into this babel of codes that Flaubert talks about, babel of private languages, private religions, and so on. At that point, value emerges as an abstract idea, at the same time it becomes visible, at the same time it becomes problematical. So value is for us then now distant from us. We're always at distance from value, whatever our own values are, or we're at distance from our lack of values, and we would like to believe and so on, but we can't, or we would like to want something, but we can't, and so on. And Nietzschean nihilism is that too. There's the marvelous remark of Nietzsche. People would rather lieber wird man das Nichts wollen als nicht wollen. That is, it would be, most people would rather wish nothingness than not wish. Das Nichts wollen rather than nicht wollen. And so that emptiness, finally, the ultimate value put in its place is some form of nihilism. Well, if that's the case, then there comes into being this optical illusion of people for whom value is still immanent. And that's clearly the pilgrims here. But it's very hard to talk about it. The same dialectic goes on as with Weber's notion of inner-worldly, otherworldly. You talk about otherworldly, but of course there isn't any other world. Everything is inner-worldly in that sense, so it's a paradoxical thing. These people are really still have value, so it's not quite the same as the values that we have. It's hard to express the difference, but this is what I think Conrad is trying to say by the idea. Now, if this is the case, we may be surprised at the possibility of sorting out some of these positions in this way. We've got a kind of antithesis between adventure, when you have a destiny, when things really happen to you, because one must say too, these pilgrims are they have no individuality, they all move, they come down like water streaming down, and they arrive at the place of pilgrimage and so on. Individual events don't happen to them. So and I'm going to call that adventure, that is this relationship to individual events, having an individual destiny, rare, unique things happening to you. There are people who have neither adventure nor the idea. They have neither value nor individual destinies. Those are our sea captains in their deck chairs in this port. Then we have those who have adventure, individual destiny, but no idea, no value. That would be, it seems to me, the Buccaneers, the Gentleman Browns, because ultimately money, which is, or rather, Jim's story will be the attempt to fill that empty place, to fill that empty slot, which the typological system allows for but can't fill. And I think we can say that it doesn't get filled because we have two halves of the book in which this is being attempted. The first half is trying to set up the situation in which it's possible, in which Jim becomes aware of how one would go about doing this. The second half, then, I think is a kind of wish fulfillment in which Jim does accede to ultimate heroism, do atonement, and so on and so forth. And at that point, then, the slack goes out, the tension goes out of this, and it goes slack, and we have the production of a bestseller, a tropical romance, so whatever you like. I'm exaggerating the difference in quality between these two parts of the book because they're very fine things in the second part, but it seems to me that it's important to understand that gears have been shifted there and that we have moved towards a wish fulfillment where the first part of the book really was problematical. Now the other way so I have a way of putting this on here where I call this courage versus value. I don't know what the advantage of that term rather than the other one is. But it is one of the other terms of the book. Courage, value, this is not value, and this would be not courage. So we have various possible syntheses. Synthesis of value and not courage, that is not violent action, are the pilgrims. Synthesis of courage and not value are the buccaneers. The neutral term, neither one nor the other, neither value nor courage, is the Europeans, the captain. And then, of course, Jim becomes the possibility of this ultimate synthesis, the complex term, which would be both courage and value, finding a place in the world for the idea, in a world which it no longer seems to inhabit naturally. And yet that immanence of value being translated into events and into action, into the possibility of action. Because the pilgrims don't do, they suffer. They're contemplative. And so what the book wants us to produce, wants to allow for the coming into being of, is, or the impossible optical illusion that the book pursues, is this idea of a unique life of action, which would at one and the same time be suffused by, be immanent, be suffused by meaning, by value. Now, of course, the trouble with that is, and this is the existential part of the way in which this anticipates existentialism, is that is an optical illusion, and that these two things are irreconcilable. And I think the optical illusion is very precisely what Sartre is describing at the end of Being in Nothingness, when he talks about what precedes the famous line, "Man is a useless passion." What he means is that he says thus the passion, I'm sort of quoting from memory, the passion of the human condition is the opposite of that of Christ, because Christ died as the en soi in order to make himself a human being, a pour soi, where human consciousness is a constant attempt to sacrifice itself in order to become an en soi, in order to become God, in order to become absolute immanence, but without losing its characteristics as consciousness, which is as distance from itself, because that's how Sartre defines consciousness, always being at distance from yourself, from the world, and so on. Well, you pursue this impossible utopian reconciliation in which you would be both transcendent and immanent at the same time. You would be what Sartre calls an en soi pour soi, an in itself, a mode of absolute being, which was yet able to be conscious of its being, but that's a contradiction, because consciousness means you're not. Consciousness in Sartrean terms always means a lack of being. So this optical illusion, which is that of our whole life choices, according to Sartre, is ultimately vain, and you have other forms of description of this in religious writing. Pascal, for example, is a very analogous kind of anatomy of the vanity of human passions and so on. Well, this is something like this, it seems to me, is going on here. That is, this is what Jim wants to achieve. And this is why it has to fail. Because if it succeeds, you're not conscious of it anymore. Jim does not become the boy in the boat who saves the two men in the very beginning. But when he sees that success, that's the anticipation. This is on page... sorry about this. Where is this? Well, it's page 12. He doesn't jump in time. And you note that that's how the later act or guilty act is programmed in advance. He learns, his subconscious learns that he should have jumped into the boat to row out to save these people in the ship that was damaged in the storm. He fails to do it. So the next time, unfortunately, the situation is reversed. Unfortunately, the next time, courage is in not jumping, but he's still programmed by this earlier kind of thing, so he jumps. And he then achieves the opposite of what he was supposed to. But what happens is more important than that. The hero comes back, tells his story, and Jim is very annoyed, jealous, envious, and so on. Jim thought it a pitiful display of vanity. The gale had ministered to a heroism as spurious as its own pretense of terror. He felt angry with the brutal tumult of earth and sky for taking him unawares and checking unfairly a generous readiness for narrow escapes. Otherwise, he was rather, and much of this is mauvaise foi in the Sartrean sense and sour grapes and so on, but there's something very important at the heart of it. Otherwise, he was rather glad he'd not gone into the cutter, since a lower achievement had served the turn. He had enlarged his knowledge more than those who had done the work. That is to say, the person who embodies courage is no longer conscious of the problem. And thus, this is a lower level of things. This is nothing but en soi. This is nothing but being. To really have it happen the way you want it, you'd have to be conscious of it. But of course, being conscious of it means not doing it, failing to do it. being distant from it. So into this kind of thing that Jim is searching for, failure is somehow programmed. This is another Sartrean idea. He says at some point that when you're involved in the world and you're acting, you are not thematically conscious of what you're doing. You're aware of these things in what Sartre calls a preconscious way, or a immanent kind of way. So you're playing tennis and you hit the ball and you're not aware of this in a self-conscious way. Self-conscious comes into being when you miss. Suddenly the gesture is broken, it falls to pieces, you're at distance from the racket, the ball, the court, what you're doing, yourself, and that's the moment of self-consciousness. Well, if that's the case, then that's what's happening to Jim here. It's because he fails that he can become aware of this. So he has to fail. So in a way, the whole Patna episode is somehow set up for him as the ideal archetype of the situation in which now he has a task to do. Because his task will be the impossible task of overcoming his cowardice, proving that he's not a coward when he can never prove that, since he always was, and since there's always since in order to remain aware, he has to be aware. In order to feel the benefit of proving your courage, you have to also be aware that you're a coward, right? I mean, if you're not aware of that, then you have then there's no incentive anymore to be courageous either. I mean, there's no problem. You just forget about it, you see. So there has to be that tension, that failure at the heart of things, and this is what happens at the end. This is why the end is also, in a much more romantic way, a similar gesture. He has to die. There seems to be something both aesthetically satisfying but also pretty gratuitous about this final episode, and it's there because Jim cannot succeed in the mode of plenitude, but only in the mode of failure. And that's the moment of self-consciousness, and it's at one with death. Now, that then seems to me is how is the way that this is that this level of the text is organized. That is around again a fragmentation of action, which, however, instead of interrogating action on the perceptual level, now interrogates it on the level of its very production itself, of how you make a choice and remain conscious of the choice at the same time, how you can become aware of that infinitesimal gap between not yet doing something and having done it. I had jumped. And how you can bridge that. And this is, therefore, an analysis of action and a process of abstraction both. And that's, I think, the final, the perspective that I would want to historicize existentialism and also Conrad in terms of. That is, I think we can, I may have said this the last time too, I think we can't read this book on its own terms. If we do that, then we say, well, of course, the problem of courage is an important human problem. Why not? Great literature can be made out of that as out of other things. Great literature is eternal. You know, the problem of courage is eternal, and so on and so on. We don't need to interrogate the form in which this narrative comes to us, and that form is the notion of the problem of courage and so forth. It seems to me that, on the contrary, we have to radically historicize it and ask ourselves what people in the middle of a business situation are doing, reading about this archaic problem, which is maybe more of a feudal problem or something. I mean, what is the role of this thing, this very strange and stylized abstraction, regressive abstraction called courage, in doing in this culture? Because this is not a culture in which what courage used to correspond to has any meaning any longer. It only has meaning in these very rare extreme situations, wartime and so on, when suddenly people rediscover that whole area of human life, which in a business civilization isn't present, or when you rewrite the drama of business life in terms of social Darwinism, and then you have a great struggle of businessmen or something, and then one rewrites that, but that's a survival too. That's compensating the reification, the alienation of business society by rewriting it in archaic terms, in feudal terms, in terms of individual struggle, and what now seems to us that more satisfying non-reified mode of human relation, human struggle, and so on. So we have to bracket these terms of the book. For Conrad, and Conrad doesn't want us to do it, of course. In his introduction, he says, I was very surprised when a friend of mine returning from Italy had talked to a lady there who didn't like the book. You know, she said, it's also morbid. The pronouncement gave me food for an hour's anxious thought. Of course, then this anxious thought also has to involve cross-cultural things too, because Conrad is coming from a country, Poland, which is a little bit like our equivalent would be Ireland, I think, where you have a kind of still romantic sense of individual gestures, and there's a whole rhetoric and a tradition of all these things. This is all being transliterated into British, where maybe that kind of raw material doesn't obtain anymore. So it's a wider cultural problem than translating than just this. The pronouncement gave me food for an hour's anxious thought. Finally, I arrived at the conclusion that, making due allowances for the subject itself being rather foreign to women's normal sensibilities, the lady could not have been an Italian. I wonder whether she was a European at all. In any case, no Latin temperament, or Polish or Irish, would have perceived anything morbid in the acute consciousness of lost honor. Honor, therefore, is not a theme that we have to defend, that we have to justify. It goes without saying that honor is a very fundamental part of our life's problematics. Well, what I'm suggesting is that the only way to historicize this, and the form of existentialism that it gives rise to, is precisely to bracket that and to say, what is this problem of honor doing here in early 20th century culture, and what does it allow Conrad to do? What is it the vehicle for? And at that point, I think we surprise again this process of abstraction. That is, the notion of honor and courage is a way of reorganizing human activity into new types of abstraction. It's a way of trying to then again counteract the breakup. Well, both the breakup of human activity and their standardization in the form of labor power, which makes all of these activities absolutely indistinguishable. It's a way of trying to recover a new or an old kind of abstraction and of talking about, and so existentialism, I would say, is in itself a process of abstracting, of trying to find a schema whereby various types of gestural content can pass. So here we have a kind of fable which constructs this abstraction of the action, courage, honor, and so forth. And then into that abstract kind of structure, we can project other types of content. And we can say, oh yes, well in my own life this would be this, or in somebody else's situation it would be this, or in this culture it would be that, and so on. But essentially it's a process whereby something is being done to compensate the standardization of gestures, events, acts, and so on. But also something is being done to ratify that abstraction, because it seems to me that abstraction is also, in the terms we used yesterday, formalizing. That is, that abstraction is also a way of undercutting history, undercutting situations, of telling us that human nature is eternal, that the problem of honor is transhistorical. So this does several things, that is, and some of them are susceptible, I think, to the type of critique that Lukács will ultimately make of other modernists. That is, some of these things are really designed to deflect us from history. Now, how do we get history back into it? It seems to me that one of the very crucial places is the story of Stein. In the life of Stein, you see. Suddenly, you surprise a kind of history which is not visible in the time scheme of the other parts of the narrative. We're told that Stein, all kinds of accidents that lead him to arrive at the place he arrives. Let me see if I can find this page here. Yeah, pages 157, 158. Stein was once. This is the heroic age of business. Stein is at one with the great moment of imperial expansion in which Western business moves into the unexplored parts of the third world, establishes trading posts and so on, and is at one with political power. So at this point, business, the activities of business have not yet become completely degraded into instrumental forms. That is, we still have a kind of political aura. It's still acting. It's still being an homme d'action or whatever to have, or to be a robber baron, or to have the possibility of a kind of older, archaic heroism in performing these missions of capitalism at this stage, which, once it freezes over into institutions, will no longer leave a place for these kinds of robber barons, buccaneers, businessmen of the heroic type. That, on a much lower level, is Stein's career. And so Stein bridges this whole period from the heroic age of business to the new period in which there can't be heroism any longer in carrying out the duties of business. Thus, we see in Stein's whole life this sort of progressive development of reification, which is little by little making this synthesis precisely of adventure and idea. Being a hero of imperialism in that sense is still offers the possibility of combining adventure and idea. But history then rules that out. So what does Stein become? A collector, butterfly collector. A collector of impressions. And this is the great image this is Conrad's great self-image of his own aesthetic. You have all these, because this is the aesthetic relationship to the world. And even you can go even further if you want to. That is, you kill these, you find these rare butterflies, you kill them in a little gas thing, I guess, and then mount them and so on. Well, think of the aesthetic which is contemporary with Conrad and in symbolism, Mallarmé's idea of language as a mode of Barthes calls it a virtual murder of the outside world. That is, the word kills the object. The famous line is, I'd have to say it in French, I guess, je dis une fleur, I wrote this down, I don't like to quote an important sentence from memory, huh? Yeah. Je dis une fleur, et hors de l'oubli, où ma voix relègue aucun contour, se lève, idée même et suave, l'absente de tout bouquet. The fact of my saying a flower automatically puts distance between myself and any real, tangible, material flowers that might exist, and causes a new type of abstraction to come into being, which is the not flower, the absent of all bouquet. So language, the very act of naming and so on, is really a murder in very much the sense in which Stein kills these butterflies and turns the world into a collection of sensations. So this is another image of the aesthetic, the collection, and Conrad's impressions are partly that too. And this foretells, beyond the story that Conrad is still able to put together using his existential motifs, it foretells a further breakdown of the novel into nothing but a series of impressions, that is, into precisely a butterfly collection of and it's not an accident that Nabokov was also a butterfly collector. And Nabokov writes his books sort of like that. I mean, we understand that he had little cards and carried them around. Whenever he saw a curious impression, he would stop and write down a sentence. And then the Nabokov novel is simply stringing these impressions together from one end to another, and then inventing a fictive plot that sort of vaguely holds them together. But this is the future of text on that impressionistic level. Now, that's the secret about history, but I think it doesn't yet tell us the immediate relationship of Jim's story to history. I would tend to look at this in the following place. That is, here we have Here we have a whole fable about courage, how you prove yourself, what destroys you or doesn't destroy you, how you become conscious of yourself. But it's all couched, if you like, I'm recapitulating again this critique I made of the Frankfurt School yesterday. It's all couched in terms of our relationship not to other people, but to nature. That is, look for the place of resistance in this work. Obviously, if you want to act out courage as a symbolic, emblematic act, you've got to have something, an adversary of some kind. What are the adversaries here? Well, I think it's very interesting that there are two very different sorts. One is nature. And some of the most remarkable pages here are those in which Conrad suddenly suggests the way in which nature unveils itself to us as being the absolute other. Page 12, the very first storm that Jim sees. There was a fierce purpose in the gale, a furious earnestness in the screech of the wind, in the brutal tumult of earth and sky that seemed directed at him and made him hold his breath in awe. Then later, the next accident, the one where he breaks his leg, only once in all that time, page 14, he had again the glimpse of the earnestness and the anger of the sea. The truth is not so often made apparent as people might think. There are many shades in the danger of adventures and gales, and it is only now and then that there appears on the face of facts a sinister violence of intention, that indefinable something which forces it upon the mind and the heart of a man that this complication of accidents or these elemental furies are coming at him with a purpose of malice, with a strength beyond control, with an unbridled cruelty that means to tear out of him his hope and his fear, the pain of his fatigue and his longing for rest, which means to smash, to destroy, to annihilate all he has seen, known, loved, enjoyed, or hated, all that is priceless and necessary, the sunshine, the memories, the future, which means to sweep the whole precious world utterly away from his sight by the simple and appalling act of taking his life. But the final image of nature is not that. It's, I don't know how you react to this detail, which seems to me one of the great moments in Conrad when Jim is talking about the bulkhead. Because the great trick, you see, is to have shown this malevolence of nature, but now to incarnate it in absolute stillness. There's not a sound. The sea is absolutely calm. Everybody's asleep. But all you know, and just this one thing like a snake going over a stick, this one sort of indication that the world is about to fall to pieces, that the very substance of the world is to fall away. And the very fact that the bulkhead is an interesting image for, it's like Melville's picture of Moby Dick smashing through the mask. It's as though suddenly now our relationship, the relationship between the world and whatever isn't the world, is a flat surface. But the way Conrad manifests this, I think is very remarkable. Jim says, "Dash it all, I tell you it bulged. I was holding up my lamp along the angle iron in the lower deck when a flake of rust as big as the palm of my hand fell off the plate all of itself." And that's something which I think suddenly puts us in the presence of a physical world which doesn't have any of the laws. That's alive. Is it hot, burning hot? That's a kind of reorganization of physical. This flake is alive in some completely other disposition of matter that we don't know anything about, and that represents somehow. That's the moment in which we sense this kind of malevolence. Well, that's one alternate. That's one version of what it is Jim has to overcome. This almost personalized malevolence of the outside world, which means to destroy him. But in fact, there's some other ones. There's a whole other picture of evil. There's the captain and his ignobility and all the rest of it, which is so marvelously rendered. Then there is later on, who's Jim's father-in-law, sort of, Cornelius, is that his name? And finally, there's Gentleman Brown himself. And I think what one is to understand there, and one could, I don't think we have time to read those things in any detail, but I could just give you an idea. He exulted thus, this is when Marlowe, because Marlowe, fortunately for us, is able to meet everybody in this story and get their version, so finally does meet Gentleman Brown after all. Fortunately, he was willing and able to talk between the choking fits of asthma, and his racked body writhed with malicious exultation at the bare thought of Jim. He exulted thus at the idea that he had, quote, paid out the stuck-up beggar after all. He gloated over his action. I had to bear the sunken glare of his fierce, crow-footed eyes if I wanted to know, and so I bore it, reflecting how much certain forms of evil are akin to madness, derived from intense egoism, inflamed by resistance, tearing the soul to pieces, and giving factitious vigor to the body. Story also reveals unsuspected depths of cunning in the wretched Cornelius, whose abject and intense hate acts like a subtle inspiration, pointing out an unerring way towards revenge. This is an alternate version of the nature of evil and of the nature of resistance, and I would suggest Conrad never uses the word, but very clearly, this representation of evil is Nietzsche's idea of ressentiment. That is, this is the mode of evil which is the envy of the strong. And in this sense, this comes from the envy of Jim as being the en soi pour soi or whatever. And this is tied in also, and I think this will be more apparent when we come to talk about Nostromo, which is a far more political book. This is also ultimately links back into Conrad's vision of politics and vision of historical change, and Conrad's counter-revolutionary positions and his what you find in things like Under Western Eyes or The Secret Agent. The idea that because in late 19th century, in the kind of late 19th century counter-revolutionary ideology that's evolved not only by Nietzsche but by other people, Taine and so on. How do you explain revolution? Well, ultimately, revolution is explained by ressentiment of two forms. Hatred of the have-nots for the haves, then hatred, even worse, of the intellectuals for the aristocrats. Because in the iconography of from Dostoevsky's Possessed, Nietzsche, Taine, all the way up to, not Orwell is an even weirder case, but all the way up to Wyndham Lewis, the idea is that the revolutionaries are failed intellectuals, failed artists. They have ressentiment. What they whip up the masses in order to sort of appease this. It's in Michelet. Even Michelet goes through the conventionnaires, the whole Comité de Salut Public, and shows that all of them were failed playwrights, failed artists, failed this, failed that. Saint-Just wrote poems. So on and so on. So this is a very deeply rooted kind of thing which is touched on here, and I think the motif of ressentiment is very important to identify. So here we have, you see, interesting possibilities for the way that this existential abstraction will be plugged back into a vision of history. One will be a vision of history which is ahistorical. Man against the elements, man against nature. That's the form in which courage can really be acted out, and our task on Earth is this thing which is obviously non-historical, because it's always been there, always will be there. So it's our relationship to death. So that's a way of defusing history, of emptying this history and these histories of their local content and making them into the metaphysical, the eternal. The other mode, when you admit the possibility that struggle and action takes place in a world of other people, and that it's rather against other people that one struggles and not only against nature or even directly against nature in any unmediated way, but that our relationship to nature is always mediated by our struggle with other people, then we get the other version. It's the homme du ressentiment that we're struggling against. It's privative evil. It's the evil of the revolutionaries, of the envious, and so on and so forth. And so we construct, and so that alternate version allows for history of a kind, but it's a kind of mythic history. And it's a kind of myth of history which will then lead into whole visions of the type of Under Western Eyes and The Secret Agent. I had a final set of reflections here, which we won't have which we won't have very much time for at all, which have to do, which are the psychoanalytic side of all this. Someone has been quoted as saying that in Conrad one cannot find a single depiction of the father-son relationship. I don't know how anybody can read this book without with an idea of that kind. I mean, it's grotesque to juxtapose what goes on in Lord Jim with that, because there's nothing but father-son relationships here, it seems to me. We become aware of them, however, through something else, which would be one way of talking about the question of the subject. I think it's important that this narrative at a certain point breaks down and becomes a non-narrative form, namely the trial. The trial is a kind of very crucial form in which the whole question of the subject is raised. Althusser, I'm saying all this very fast, and I think we will want to come back to it next term, but Althusser talks about the subject in terms of the creation of the subject, in terms of interpellation. The subject is constituted when someone else calls you by name. The little child is named, and suddenly it's a subject, because it's a subject for someone else, the adults. Later on, the subject, Althusser's example at the end of his essay in London Philosophy on ideological state apparatuses, there's a long, very important passage on interpellation, on how a subject comes into being. And there, of course, the example, but it's odd that he picks a medieval example, sort of, a pre-capitalist example, is God. God is the person who calls you by name. God is the person who's looking at you and who gives you a name and who's thinking about you and thus who constitutes you as a subject. Now, the trial is the place where this process is ritually reenacted, because in the trial, as subject, you are judged. And that's the place then of your being reconstituted as a subject. And then particularly in 19th century literature, that becomes a marvelous vehicle for all kinds of historical things. That is, you have a whole series of 19th century trial novels in which the crime is the key way in which you interrogate the very fiber of the national subject. The brothers Karamazov give the very secret of the Russian character, and their trial, or Dmitri's trial, is the place where you find out what the Russian character is. Les Déracinés, the trial there is a way of doing something to parts of the French national character, and so on and so forth. There are lots of examples of that. I think something like that clearly is happening here. The trial scene is the moment in which Jim is being called into question as a subject and interrogated in his very character as a subject. Well, then we have a whole series of judges who range from the physical father all the way to Marlowe. We have Brierly, who was a very interesting judge, because then a week later he commits suicide. We have Marlowe. Finally, we have the French captain who gives us a judgment from a related culture, who confirms the fact that this is the fact of this problem being a more widely international kind of problem than a merely British one, and who also is unwilling to exonerate Jim. And that's why he has to be there at that point, because the Jim story then has to go on to find another resolution. Brierly kills himself. We don't know what that means. Marlowe becomes willing to exonerate Jim. When we get to the Frenchman, they have a long discussion. He understands, of course, how this might have happened. So on, Marlowe says, "I'm glad you're able to be so lenient." He says, "That's not what I meant. One cannot be lenient. One can understand that this might happen, but one cannot justify the loss of honor." And so one understands everybody's afraid, this is there, and so forth. Well, I think it's important. So there's a whole system of fathers, judges, and of course he's killed by a father at the end. That's the final judgment. And there's a whole series of substitutions of that kind too, that I think one would have to take into account if one were to do a kind of complete reading of this. I think, though, that leads us back to other alternatives. That is, here again, we have a kind of psychological alternative and a historical alternative. We have the possibility of looking at this as an interrogation from the point of view of the judge now. The judge will ask the question, what is human nature, fear, can people overcome fear, and so on and so on. And this deflects the whole thing, Jim's problem, into a realm of the ahistorical, that of human nature. But there is still a historical alternative, and Brierly blurts this out, and so does Marlowe at a certain point. This is not a question of psychology. This is not a psychological examination at all. This only looks as though it's interrogating la condition humaine, or human psychology, or why people behave the way they do under stress or whatever. Nothing of that kind. This is a matter of the very fabric of society and of what keeps, and of legitimation. Why I long to go grubbing into the deplorable details of an occurrence which, after all, concern me, Marlowe says, no more, but no less, than as a member of an obscure body of men held together by a community of inglorious toil and by fidelity to a certain standard of conduct. The reason this is important is that if this can happen, the whole fabric that holds behavior together, and this is, I think it's been said that this Conrad's whole ship, commercial maritime kind of world is the world of bureaucracy, that is, of the heroic bureaucracy of late 19th century capitalism. And so this is, this really very much, these people incarnate the ideas of service and so on that you can find in British bureaucracy, but you find it in the various nation states in slightly different forms. And then in Weber is the very theory of this whole process, which for him is the ultimate form of the modern state. So interrogating what can destroy bureaucracy is interrogating what can destroy the very state itself. And we have other versions of this. Brierly says, Marlowe says, and here this thing is rearticulated in terms of father-son relationships. I would bring these people up, and then later on I meet them as young men, and they become captains in their own right, and so on. I'm very proud of that, and so on and so on. Jim was like that. Don't I remember the little so-and-sos? I tell you that I ought to know the right kind of looks. I would have trusted the deck to that youngster on the strength of a single glance and gone to sleep with both eyes. And by Jove, it wouldn't have been safe. There are depths of horror in that thought. That is, we're engaged in the process of social reproduction. We're creating new generations of people who staff and man the society. Here's the case of somebody who's absolutely sound and the proper sort and all the rest of it socially and everything else. And something happens. Something snaps. So what's beyond this, and I want just to read the Brierly thing too, because, this is what Brierly says. We aren't an organized body of men, and the only thing that holds us together is just the name for that kind of decency. Such an affair destroys one's confidence. This is, I think, a very veiled way of reconnecting the drama of Jim, then back to the very drama of legitimation that holds middle-class society together. And this is the point, I think, this is one of the other edges at which this touches, if you like, not history, but society, or history in the form of society. But again, this is very controlled, and it's repressed, and it's possible not to see this, and to substitute for it. We always have the option of deflecting it from history, of reading it in the other way, of reading it in the psychologizing way, the non-historical, the metaphysical way, and so on. And I think that also is part of the very strategies of modernism and the way that modernism manages its content. We have a buried historical content which is arranged for us in such a way that we may deal with it non-historically. And there, too, I think Lukács is both right and wrong in his judgments on these things. Okay, sorry to have went on so long. And we'll see then other parts of Conrad and other developments of this in Nostromo, which is a novel which wishes to be the story of history itself and to come to contact with history.